Hi, I'm Nate Seberg, and this is One Day Ahead. Welcome to the Teaching Romeo and Juliet video series. So we've done the big picture, a little pre-reading, and we've tackled the prologue. Today, we are gonna stop screwing around. This video is going to discuss how I walked through Act 1 from a teacher's perspective. The rest of the series can be found at onedayahead.com, along with my Romeo and Juliet summary and analysis series, teaching materials, and a bunch more. All right, let's go. Let's start by naming what I'm not doing in this video. You have a whole chart in the teaching materials and a dedicated video that will tell you what to read, what to watch, what to skip, and when I make those transitions, so I'm not doing that here. Also, in the summary and analysis series, you are going to find a dedicated video that hits every beat of every scene. That series gets granular. These videos, they stay out of the muck. I'm going to give you the things in each scene that I zero in on, either because they cause confusion or because they are opportunities for discussion and analysis. This is where I point the spotlight when I integrate the teaching materials and what I've learned to preempt or avoid. Before we get to each scene, let's talk about how we tackle this text at a practical level. In my class, we read this aloud and entirely on a volunteer basis. You are not taking reading parts. You are the eye of the storm. You are handling the stage directions, handing out and switching parts, adding commentary, making fun of the characters, and occasionally your own students. And the first thing I want you to do on the very first day is to give a reading part to your strongest reader. Let them get 10 lines in and then very publicly switch them to someone else. Why do this? To establish that frequently switching parts is something we do here, and that it has nothing to do with your reading ability. It's a bit of a charade, but it is worth it because it gives you social cover for later when you get a struggling reader who ends up in a monster part and you need to move things along, but you don't want to embarrass the kid. Well, now you can pull it because it's not about ability. I mean, we already proved it with the other kid. I mean, it totally is about ability, but Okay, let's get to Act 1, Scene 1. And I want to tell you, you're pretty well screwed right from the jump. It is a very tough start to this play. The whole conversation between Samson and Gregory it's very hard. I have a whole video on only the first 40 lines, and what it's going to do, it's going to take a kid who maybe already is looking for a reason to quit this book, and it is going to give them that reason. The start is full of repartee and 400-year-old references, so the second thing I want you to do the very first day is to establish a phrase that we will use throughout the entire book. It's a phrase that means, hey, don't worry about this part. You are not stupid for not understanding this passage, and that phrase is Shakespeare nonsense. I like it. It's dismissive and it externalizes the problem, and I establish it right here. Jokes about carrying coals. Yeah, that is Shakespeare nonsense. Move on. Your job in a nutshell is knowing what is worth struggling with, what you should point kids at and encourage them to fight with, what has payoff, and what should simply be labeled as Shakespeare nonsense and move on with our lives. So Act 1, Scene 1 starts with the Capulet thugs, and I point out all the threats of physical and sexual violence. You're going to point this out because later we are going to compare their ruffian language to the more flowery prose and high ideals of their social betters. When the mini riot gets underway, be ready for this line from Capulet. "What noise is this? Give me my longsword, ho." This always gets a laugh, and I take it as an opportunity to define a few Shakespeare words that live on the board the whole time. They are soft, wherefore, and ho. Ho means like, pay attention to this. Finally, in the second half of the scene, I find kids have trouble tracking Romeo's depression because the woman that he is in love with is never named. So go ahead and tell them. Tell them before he even gets around to it. He is in love with a woman named Rosaline, and she wants to be a virgin forever. Either because she really does, or equally possible, Romeo came on so strong she felt like a regular no just wouldn't cut it. I do this because I want them thinking about how much Romeo sucks, and they won't notice if they spend all of their time trying to figure out why he's so sad. Act 1 is about establishing Romeo and Juliet as individuals. Here I take the chance to paint Romeo as lovesick, mopey, whiny, and melodramatic. This kid needs a hobby. Following Scene 1 is where I typically put the choose your house activity that's in the unit, but it can really go about anywhere. Scene 2 is Paris asking if he can up and marry Juliet, and the boys finding out about the party. Two things to zero in on. The first comes from Capulet about Juliet. She hath not seen the change of 14 years. I make sure they understand that the girl is 13. This also will create a stir, and I don't lift a finger to defend the weirdness here. You could go into a whole like it was a different time thing, but like why. Don't do it. Put yourself with the kids and talk about how this is gross. The second line, but woo her, gentle Paris, get her heart. My will to her consent is but a part. Capulet is saying she has to want to marry you. Her opinion matters too. I bring this up because it so doesn't later in the play. Final quick note here, when the servant happens upon Romeo, he says this, which will throw them. It means God give you a good evening. So heads up. Scene 3 is really our introduction to Juliet. But first, you might spend some time pointing out how off the rails the nurse is. Your mileage really may vary with her. A lot of the nurse's humor is wrapped up in subtly getting common sayings wrong in a sexual way, but it's also another example of how those low on the social ladder are unrefined and cartoonish compared with the highborn. So do that or don't. The real thing to focus on in this scene is Juliet, specifically how she responds to her mother regarding Paris. She says, I'll look to like if looking liking move, but no more deep will I dart mine eye than your consent gives strength to make it fly. That response is badass. Her fundamental purpose in this society, this is super mean, but it was to marry well. That was her whole job. And when she gets a proposal from the most eligible bachelor in her society and she says maybe, that's amazing. Then she softens it by saying, I'm your daughter and I'll only look if you consent to the match. So between you and me, that's what made it into the whole summary and analysis video. But between you and me, everything I just said there it's debatable. That interpretation is on the table, but it's doing a lot of work with a little. It suits my purposes to define Juliet as independent and spirited, and it's where we're going anyway, so I feel okay about it. Now, Act 1, Scene 4. I skip it. I skip it outright. Shakespeare was on a bender when he wrote this one. It's in the summary and analysis series if you want the details, but I'm telling you, it is a long way to go for not a lot of payoff. It's important that we meet Mercutio for the plot, but I let the movie handle that and we move on. We got some star-crossed lovers to kill here, people. Instead of reading Scene 4, I have students make masks for the Scene 5 party. It's in the teaching unit. I give them a bunch of supplies in 8 minutes and we wear them for the next scene. It's super campy, but students love a mask. What can you do? Finally, Scene 5. The important thing here is to help students understand the geography of these conversations. Shakespeare doesn't actually put in a lot of stage directions, and students have trouble inferring the groupings. For example, when Tybalt is doing his whole I'm going to kill Romeo thing, Romeo has moved along and doesn't hear him. When the meet cute is over, Juliet learns Romeo's name, but by this point, he is actually now across the party. If you have students standing to read this, they have a natural tendency to just bunch together in the front of the room. You need to move them around the room for the geography of this whole thing to make any sense. A few more things. Pause the action right before Romeo and Juliet first speak. This is where I do the Shakespeare's take on the sonnet activity. This sets them up to realize that their first conversation combines like a zipper to create a perfect Shakespearean sonnet, which is cool. Finally, when I show the movie, I make sure to point out this frame in particular. I make it a recurring bit about how much 2021's sexiest man alive, Paul Rudd, loves balloons. Doing this is a long-term setup for the funeral at the very close of the play. When we bury Paris's character autopsy, I bring a balloon with me, I pop it, I bury it with them. They almost actually cry. And that's teaching Act 1. We have established Romeo and Juliet as individuals and placed them in the context of an inflexible society. Thank you for watching. You can check out all my stuff, including this whole series and more on onedayahead.com. Next episode, we head to Act 2, where we get these two crazy kids hitched. We'll see you next time on One Day Ahead.